Hello everyone. It's raining pretty hard as I'm recording this. I hope the sound of the rain doesn't get onto this recording, but I guess we'll find out. Today in this lecture what I want to do is to introduce the topic of informal logical fallacies. This is the material from chapter 2 of our textbook. We'll go through this fairly quickly. I'll give you some preliminaries and then I'll ask you to go read another, or not read, but watch another video, one called Common Fallacies, and then you'll come back and finish this video. At least that's the ideal way to do this. You could just watch this all the way through and then afterwards watch the Common Fallacies video, but I think the first way that I mentioned is the better way to do it. Also, a good idea for you to have read every word in chapter 2 before you go on to do the homework exercise, which will be all of the exercises at the end of that chapter. All right, so what is a fallacy then? Well, a fallacy is a kind of argument, one that seems, at first at least, to be persuasive, but which on deeper analysis turns out to be a bad argument. And we're talking here really not about specific cases of bad arguments when we talk about fallacies. A fallacy is a kind or a type of argument. We can say that an individual argument commits a fallacy. In other words, it's a case that falls under that type. Now, fallacies can fail to prove their conclusions in various different ways. This is to make the point that fallacies are kinds of bad argument, but they're not just bad arguments, right? They're bad arguments, or types of bad arguments that are really rhetorical tricks. That is, they're tricks of language, tricks of thinking that are supposed to fool people. Okay, so the fallacies that we'll be looking at are going to fail to prove their conclusions. They'll fail to prove their conclusions in various ways, as we'll see. But generally speaking, we can say that they're all unsound. And they can be unsound in a couple of different ways. You probably remember the definition of soundness. We say that an argument is sound when it's valid and it has all true premises. And we've defined validity as the situation where when or if the premises of an argument are all true, it turns out to be impossible for the conclusion to be false. So that's the definition of soundness. So an argument in general can fail to be sound either by being invalid or by having premises that aren't known to be true. And we'll see that there are examples of fallacies that break both of those kinds of rules. So what we're aiming at here in this lecture is to learn about some of the most common types of fallacies, including why they're bad arguments and in particular how to spot them when you see them. And then to learn how to avoid being fooled when other people are trying to make arguments and to manipulate you when those arguments contain fallacies. This is something actually that is very timely, given that this is a presidential election year. Being aware of fallacies and being able to spot them is going to be an especially useful thing because, well, unfortunately, politicians just use fallacies all the time. That's partly because people are more easily manipulated than they are reasoned with. Unfortunately, that's just a fact about humans. And politicians sometimes deliberately manipulate people using fallacies. So if you are able to know when a fallacy is occurring, you're then able to avoid being fooled by something that you shouldn't believe. So that's to say that you can think of this part of the class in particular as a kind of intellectual self-defense. By becoming an excellent reasoner, you can avoid being fooled. There's another advantage too, which is that the better you get at reasoning, the better you'll be able to construct your own arguments and to defend your own case to make some conclusion that you're interested in proving. All right, so pause here, go to the video that's called Common Fallacies, and then come back to this slide, slide 6, at the 4:15 mark, and you'll pick up from here. Okay, so now that you've watched that other video on common fallacies, here are a few additional ones that aren't mentioned there. The straw person argument, or the fallacy of straw person, is a fallacy where somebody attacks an argument that isn't really the argument that their opponent made. Right? So imagine a setup where person A gives some argument, and it has a certain set of premises and a conclusion. But then the second person attempts to disprove the first person's conclusion, but by coming up with some other argument that isn't the one that the first person discussed, and then the second person critiques this new argument that isn't the one that the first person offered. Now, the name straw argument comes from the fact that in World War I, soldiers were taught how to use their bayonets by running through obstacle courses where they would stab straw-filled bales. Right? Sometimes they were person-shaped, like in this example. And obviously, it's pretty easy to defeat a straw person, right? But it's much easier to defeat a real enemy in a battle situation. So the problem with the fallacy that we call the straw person fallacy or the straw argument fallacy, the problem that's committed there is that you haven't really defeated the first person's argument. You've defeated, in effect, a caricature of it. So it's a kind of missing of the point. Sometimes it's a deliberate thing, sometimes it's an accident, or it's because somebody didn't understand the original argument properly. Whatever the cause, though, when you attack a straw argument, you're not really attacking the genuine target. And so it's always a fallacy. You can't draw any conclusions from that sort of argument. The next argument type, or the fallacy type that I want to include here that wasn't mentioned in the other video is called the red herring fallacy. And there's a case that's made in our textbook about why it's called the red herring fallacy. I've done some research and I found out that that story isn't true, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. Even if nobody really knows why it's called the red herring fallacy, it's a very well-known name for a fallacy, and it means something very specific. And in the red herring fallacy, somebody essentially is just trying to distract you by mentioning something that's irrelevant. Obviously, it's something that, often it's something that's attention-grabbing, and it's something that leads you to another kind of conclusion, but it's not really relevant to the original point. So it's kind of like shouting squirrel and trying to distract your dog so that you can do something like maybe hide the ball so the dog doesn't bother you anymore. Well, anyway, the fallacy here is really a fallacy of distraction, right? It's about trying to get somebody to believe a conclusion, not for a good reason, but for some irrelevant reason that's not connected to the original point. Next, we have hasty generalization. You'll see in a minute that this is related to another fallacy called accident, and the two are kind of the inverse of each other. In a hasty generalization, somebody starts from a single case or a small number of cases, and they make a generalization that everything must be like that. All right, so here's an example. I've only met one Canadian, and he was nice, therefore I conclude that all Canadians are nice. Now, if you've met enough Canadians, maybe you could draw this conclusion, but if you only met one Canadian, then that's making an inference from too small of a sample. So it's a hasty generalization in the sense that you're drawing a general conclusion too quickly from too little information. Next, we have the fallacy of accident. Fallacy of accident involves applying a general rule to a specific case that that rule doesn't properly cover. So we would all agree that speeding is illegal, but if you're a police officer, you pull somebody over and you find out that they're rushing a woman to a hospital to give birth, you're not going to give them a ticket. Okay, so if you drew the argument that, well, you were speeding, that therefore you deserved a ticket, that would be true in general, but it might not be true in a specific case. It might not be true if the speeding is done by an emergency vehicle in an emergency situation, or if it's done to save a life or to escape a dangerous person or something like that. So there are going to be exceptions to rules, and to blindly follow rules is often to miss the point. So when people do that, when they apply rules to cases that they don't fit, we call that the fallacy of accident. This is a name or a title for this fallacy that goes back to the medieval logicians. Has to do with the idea that this case is only incidentally related to the rule, so not actually related to the rule. So accident is from a specific case, accident is from a general rule to a specific case. Hasty generalization, or converse accident, is from a specific case to a general rule. Now, there are good cases of reasoning from specific instances to a generalization, but you have to have enough specific instances in order to make that generalization follow from the evidence. Accident and converse accident are similar to two other fallacies, so we should be clear to distinguish them. Accident and converse accident are about cases and rules. Composition and division are about parts and wholes. So in the fallacy of composition, what's happening is that somebody assumes that what's true of a part of a thing is therefore true of the whole. Here's an example. Each part of this airplane is made from the lightest materials, therefore the airplane is light too. It's pretty easy to see in this case that that conclusion doesn't follow from those premises. You might have incredibly light parts, but if you have enough of them, the airplane might still not be light, might be heavy instead. Fallacy of division just goes in the other direction. We'd say something like, this airplane is very heavy, therefore each of its parts is very heavy. And obviously that's not true. That conclusion doesn't follow because, well, you might have a light switch that's not very heavy at all. So that conclusion wouldn't follow. Okay, so composition and division are about parts and wholes. And when you go from a part and you compose the whole, that's called the fallacy of composition. When you divide the whole and you make an inference to the part, that's the fallacy of division. In the other common fallacies video that you watched, the fallacy of equivocation was mentioned. And it was pointed out that equivocation is really a grammatical problem. It's only when you then use that grammatical problem to create an argument that you end up with a fallacy. And amphiboly is the same thing. Amphiboly is an ambiguity that occurs when a sentence is written in an improper way. Specifically, it's written in a way where it's open to several readings or several meanings. So you can use that kind of ambiguity of meaning in an argument, and when you do that, you commit the fallacy of amphiboly. Very like equivocation, but instead of being at the word level, it's at the sentence level. The fallacy of accent is another one that depends on sliding between different meanings in the same argument. You can say words and sentences with different emphases to change their meaning. Here's a good example. Take the sentence, "We should not speak ill of our friends." Think of all the different ways that you could emphasize the different words in this, kind of like an acting exercise. You might say, "We should not speak ill of our friends," or "We should not speak ill of our friends," or "We should not speak ill of our friends." "We should not speak ill of our friends." "We should not speak ill of our friends." You can sort of hear the implications of different meanings that come from different emphases or accents that are applied to the different words in that sentence. If you do something like this in an argument where you accent a sentence in one way to get an understanding of the premise and then do it in a different way to get a different meaning in the conclusion, then that's the fallacy of accent. Again, it's in the same category as the fallacy of equivocation. It's a fallacy based on multiple meanings and sliding between them in an argument. Okay, so now manipulative framing, and this is a bit like a loaded question. It's a situation where you create a context where saying something is going to make your readers think one thing when really that's probably not what's true. It's a good example in the textbook of the phrase tax relief and how that creates all kinds of positive emotions, implies that taxes are bad and that you need relief from them and so on, when in fact that might not be actually what's going on. All right, so manipulative framing is where you create a context that essentially persuades people to read something or understand something in a way that isn't truthful or accurate. Okay, so that's all I'm going to mention on fallacies. I want you to now make sure that you've read all of Chapter 2 and make sure that you get all the details of these definitions and the subtleties that are involved. And then, of course, look at the examples that are in the text to help yourself understand each of these fallacy types. Now, for your homework for week 2, what I want you to do is all of the exercises on pages 61 through 67. It sounds like a lot, excuse me, but it's really not that many because the answer that you give is just a name of a fallacy. I'd like you to supplement the answer not just by giving the name of the fallacy, but by trying to give a sentence or two where you explain why that's the fallacy that's being committed. You don't need to rewrite the question, just give me the answer. And if you want to, you can type this up and submit it as a Word file, or you can handwrite it and take a photo of what you've written and upload that instead. Okay, let me know if you have any questions. See you on the flip side.